everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's spend the next few moments together studying a little bit of Jewish history. Now, tonight will be the end of our, what we call our third round of the program, as we conclude the time period of the Second Commonwealth. And next week we'll begin the fourth round with the aftermath of the destruction of the temple. If you missed any sessions, don't worry. They are all available on TorahAnytime.com. They're all linked to on our website, TorahCleveland.com. And every session is self-contained, but feel free to go back and listen to other sessions, share them with your friends, tell everybody this is the greatest Jewish history program that is going on right now on the World Wide Web. And it's just such a pleasure to have you here, and let's dive right in. So tonight, as we're going to discuss the destruction of the Second Temple, the destruction of the Second Commonwealth of Judah, and the beginning of the Roman wars, the multitude of wars that happened between the Jews and the Romans, it's definitely a dark time in Jewish history, no doubt about it. And it brings out so much of what is still not been corrected in the Jewish world. And what I mean by this is our sages, first of all, our sages in the times of the Talmud, the commentaries after the sealing of the Talmud. Every time we see a Jewish tragedy, there is an effort to try to make sense of it on a hashkafic, on a philosophical level. And part of the concept is, first of all, we always believe we should learn from everything. Nothing in history is random. Nothing happens without a purpose. And therefore, if we're going to see such a terrible situation happen, like we're going to discuss tonight, there has to be an underlying reason for it. And our sages come to the conclusion that the underlying reason is what we call sinas chinam, baseless hatred, one Jew to another. And we'll get into that in depth tonight, or where they actually saw it in the war. But really, the idea that we all need to take out of this is what is built on this, is once our sages say that the temple was destroyed because of baseless hatred, one Jew to another, then what is it that we must correct in exile to be able to see the redemption of the Jewish people, the entirety of the Jewish people return to Israel, the third Beis Hamikdash, the third temple to be rebuilt, the enemies of the Jewish people stop threatening our existence, etc., etc. What needs to happen for that to take place? We have to rectify this baseless hatred, one Jew to another. So it's just an interesting lesson that'll come out of all this, that there's something we have to learn from these actions. As I talk about it tonight, yes, it's going to be a terrible time in history, but you'll look at some of the issues that are going on and you'll say, hey, that sounds familiar. Well, it's unfortunately those issues that have been going on for 2,000 years that have left us as a nation in exile. And God willing, we can learn from programs like this and other wonderful resources to be better as a people and hopefully get to the point where we can truly see the redemption of the Jewish people. So we pick up tonight's discussion. The great-grandson of Herod, who was known to us as Herod Agrippa II, had the title of the king of Judea. Now, Herod Agrippa II was in many ways a throwback to his to his grandfather or great-grandfather Herod. He was not like his father, Herod Agrippa I, who we see had a good relationship with the rabbis, tried to live his life as a sincere Jew. Herod Agrippa II is all Roman. And even though we're going to see, probably for his own political gain, he does make attempts to reconcile between the Jews and the Romans, because the Jews suspect him, and rightfully so from the beginning, as being Roman first and Jewish second. They never trust him when it comes to his interplay with the Romans. And we're going to see ultimately he will side with the Romans in the first war between the Jews and the Romans. Now, the prelude to the destruction finds the country of Judea in just total anarchy. We have a situation where, yes, Herod Agrippa II is technically the ruler, but he is not a ruler that has a lot of power. The Romans have gone back to their system of governance where they put the governor or the procurator into place in the country. And as we said before, one was worse than the next. Each one just wanted their own financial gain, did not care about helping the Jewish people, or Rome for that matter. And we'll see that it led to a terrible situation and was really the flicker that will set the tinderbox afire with everything that was going on. Now, with all this anarchy, there are many Jews that will leave Israel, that will go back to Babylon, or go to Babylon, where we haven't talked a lot about Babylon during the Second Commonwealth, because we don't have a lot written about Babylon during the Second Commonwealth. But everything we are told is the community was completely flourishing at this time. What is unclear is what the population or the demographic breakup was. Does the country of Judea / Israel ever become the population center during the Second Commonwealth? Probably not. I often say not, that it was never the population center, that Babylon remains the population center, but it definitely waxes and it wanes. At this point, with the anarchy that's going on in Israel during the second part of the first century, before the destruction, we're going to see definitely the tides turn back to Babylon. We're going to see many Jews, before the war ever starts, rightfully so, reading the proverbial writing on the wall and heading back to Babylon. And that happens during this time period, during the time period of Agrippa II. Now, one interesting thing about Agrippa II, just to show what kind of character we were dealing with, his sister, whose name is Bernice, had a number of failed marriages, basically to Romans who converted to Judaism superficially to try and look Jewish, but really weren't sincere in that. In the end, it seems that she marries Agrippa II, or doesn't marry, but has has a incestuous relationship with Agrippa II. It's going to be one of the many reasons that Agrippa II does not find favor with the rabbis. But just to show you the kind of person we were dealing with. Now, interestingly enough, and maybe we'll come back to her later, Bernice ultimately will have a romantic relationship with Titus, who will become the emperor of Rome, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But Titus will basically be told that he has to break his relationship off with Bernice in order to take on the role as leader of the Roman Empire. Okay, interesting little piece that maybe we'll get to, maybe we won't. I don't know. We'll see. But anyways, let's keep going into the Prelude of Destruction that we have tonight. So our sages tell us that before the destruction of the Second Temple, Chavdad Kitim B'Yerushalayim, that there were 24 sectarian groups, 24 different factions within the Jewish people in Jerusalem and Israel at this time. Now, when we understand that what plagued the Jewish people at this time was this baseless hatred, it makes sense that if you have 24 sectarian groups, 24 factions fighting one another for power, we'll see really fighting, because it'll get to civil war at many times, then you can understand why our rabbis would later look and say, you know what, it was that baseless hatred. It was the Jews working against each other and not with each other that caused this to happen. Now, like, you think it's a problem in the Knesset nowadays where you have, I don't know, what is it now, 10 political parties, maybe 7 of which have power, and the fighting that goes on there, it was a lot worse during the end of the Second Commonwealth with these 24 different groups. Now, who were these 24 different groups? We're not at this point necessarily given names for all of them, but we do know a lot of the names. First off, the one that we all descend from is the Perushim. And the end of the day, the Perushim are going to be the only ones that will survive all this. Perushim is often translated in English as Pharisees. Now, as I believe I've quoted many times before, that if you look up the word Pharisees in your Webster's Dictionary or dictionary.com or whatever you choose to look it up in, it'll give you the historically accurate definition first, the rabbis at the time of the Second Temple, etc., and then it will give you the colloquial definition of a serpent, a sly person, a backstabber, a cutthroat, whatever it is. Because ultimately, as we talked a little bit about last week, we'll talk more in future classes, that the Perushim, lock, stock, and barrel, will reject the early Christians and really put them down in a strong-handed way. And therefore, in the Christian Bible and in Christian theology, the Pharisees are regarded as terrible, terrible people, but we're the Pharisees. We're the descendants of the Pharisees. When we talk about the Pharisees, we're talking about Hillel, Shammai, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, etc. All the great rabbis of the Talmud, both of the Mishnah and the Gemara, those are the Pharisees. So the group that will ultimately win will be the Pharisees. Now, their position, the position of the rabbis, was to live to fight another day. This is quite often in Jewish history the perspective of the rabbis. Now, Hanukkah was one different situation, but in general, the rabbis understand that the Jewish people are doing wrong, understand that if there is a Roman tormentor, there's a reason for it, and have the foresight to be able to say there's no way we can go against Rome. We have a concept that we talk about of Chacham Einam Barosho, that a wise person has eyes in his head, and that is really the meaning of what our sages say when they say Chacham Adif Minavi, that a wise person is greater than a prophet, because a prophet can only tell you the prophecy that he or she receives from the Almighty, but the wise person can be roye es nolad, can look at a situation today and tell you what's going to happen based on the facts, can learn from history, so to speak. So the Prushim said, don't fight Rome, let's appease Rome, we have to work with Rome, this is not what we want to do. And ultimately, that's going to be the view that survives. Our old friends, the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, have made a comeback at this time. They were never stumped out completely, and they make a somewhat noticeable comeback at this time. As opposed to where before they actually took over the Sanhedrin, here they're going to make their own Sanhedrin, their own high court that'll run, I guess, in competition, if you will, to the main Sanhedrin. We have a group called the Sekrikin, who's one of the Zealot groups. The Biryonim, another one of the Zealot groups. We have the term Zealots that we see a lot of times. Kenoyim, was that a separate group or just defining a lot of the radical groups? Not so clear. We have the group that we mentioned last week, the Essenes, who were the firmer than thou, the more religious than thou, the celibates, the ones that the early Christians probably developed out of or developed into from them. They were in the southern part of the country, and we have the famous Dead Sea people. Dead Sea people. There were many who originally thought when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found that the Dead Sea Scrolls were the Essenes, but now we know that it was a separate group that was not so far from the Essenes, maybe a breakoff from the Essenes. They were geographically close to where the Essenes stationed themselves. They were outside of Jerusalem because their whole approach was, we ain't getting involved in any of this, we're just going away and living in mud huts. And that's who the Dead Sea people were. So it's interesting because when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of it jives with what we have. Some of it lines up perfectly, and if anything, just validates the proper way that our Tanakh, that the Jewish Bible, has been transmitted from generation to generation, and the accuracy of it. Now, some of it does not jive. There are definitely parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, seemingly parts of the Dead Sea people's Bible, that is not the same as our 24 books of Tanakh. Now, I believe we mentioned previously that the 24 books of Tanakh are already canonized at this point. It's unclear exactly when they were canonized, but the approach of one of my favorite historians, Rabbi Dr. Schneur Lyman, is that it was the time of the Maccabees, Judah Maccabee, the time of the Hanukkah story, that's when the Tanakh became canonized and sealed as a 24-book edition, and from that point on, everything else was kept out, was considered apocrypha, sifri. It's chitzonim, external books. That's what it is. So with that being the case, when we look at our 24 books and we see other books in the Dead Sea Scroll, there are those amongst the academics who have raised that as a question onto the authenticity of how our Tanakh has been transmitted. What I say to that is, once we know that this was this was definitely a sectarian group, definitely not a big group, definitely not the mainstream, that whoever was in charge of these scrolls was not the group that survived for sure, then that does not present a question to us at all, because it's obvious with everything that we see in Josephus and the Talmud and Jewish history that there was sectarianism going on at this time. There were dissenting groups, and the fact they had a group down by the Dead Sea who was really into scrolls, who had a 151st Psalm and this book and that book that we don't have in our Tanakh. Okay, they were a sectarian group that had broken away from the mainstream. Doesn't bother us at all. If anything, we look at what's similar in the fact that is exactly the same as or pretty much exactly the same as what we have today, and that validates that our books have been transmitted accurately, and it validates our history that says there are sectarian groups that did their own thing, and in this case added their own books and added their own psalms or whatever it might be. So in my humble opinion, the Dead Sea Scrolls only come to validate the Jewish tradition, the traditional history that I aim to teach, and everything that we see in the Talmud and etc., and accept as our history and accept as the truth of Judaism. So that's the Dead Sea Scrolls for you. Again, this wasn't meant to be an in-depth exploration. They are fascinating, and I don't want to minimize a fascinating topic, but as this is pretty much a Jewish history survey, we don't have the time to delve deeper into them right now. Okay, we also had Roman sympathizers. In other words, I want to make clear that the Perushim, that the rabbis, were not Roman sympathizers. They were Roman appeasers. They felt it was ridiculous. They felt what these zealot groups were doing and wanting to fight the Romans was ridiculous, and that's what they were against. But there were people who were actually the Roman sympathizers, led by Agrippa II, and unfortunately there were others with him, and that was a situation that had to be dealt with as well at this time. Okay. In the year 54, we mentioned before the Roman Emperor Claudius, who was a good friend of Agrippa I, seemed to do pretty good things for Israel. That was a time of relative peace before, calm before the storm that we're dealing with now. When he dies, he is succeeded by Nero. Now, Nero is he takes over in 54, takes over Rome in 54, and is a very interesting character. There's the famous story about how Nero fiddled while Rome burnt. That's a literary quote, because Nero was in many ways a Renaissance personality. He was very into the arts and very into music, and supposedly did play the violin and himself participated in the arts. Now, in the end of the day, Nero is going to, there's going to be a rebellion against him in the Roman Senate. He's going to be sentenced to death. And according to Roman tradition, Dio Cassius and others, he commits suicide before the Senate's police officers or whatever it is ever catch up to him to carry out the death sentence. That's what Roman history says. We'll see in a minute that Jewish history says something quite different, but interesting nonetheless. Be it as it may, Nero is the one on the throne when the actual rebellion takes place. Now, at this point, even though Herod Agrippa II still has whatever title he has, the Roman governors are in place, and at this point, the Roman governor is somebody by the name of Gessius Florus. And Gessius Florus, like many before him, had the goal of just whatever he could do to gain financially. And he actually provokes the Jews to rebellion. He basically ransacks the temple, takes everything out of the temple treasury for himself. He, in the city of Caesarea, which was still a heavily Greek-Roman city, mainly a Greek-Roman city, that Caesarea never became a Jewish city, by the way. It really, from time immemorial, was always a Greek, then a Roman city. Now I know it's a big concert location in Israel, which really fits with it being a Greek city. And the governor, Gessius Florus, basically provokes a rebellion of the Jews that live near Caesarea with the local Roman Greeks that are there. It provokes a rebellion in a certain synagogue, and the way that Josephus describes the story is 3,600 men, women, and children are slaughtered at that time, and this really is what provokes the rebellion in the whole country, because when word of this gets back to Jerusalem, this is the straw that breaks the camel's back with all the tension. This is the spark, the amber that lights the tinderbox. And the Jews, especially those of the different zealot groups, take to the streets of Jerusalem, rebelling openly against Roman rule in Israel. Now, at the early stages, Agrippa II really tries to act as a mediator. He tries to encourage the zealots not to rebel, and he tries to convince Rome that the rebellion, so to speak, is only against Gessius Florus, the governor, and for his terrible ways, for his thievery, etc., and that's not really against Rome. Now, that, for Agrippa II, you might ask, why did he intercede? Did he really care over here? We're going to see he's a complete Roman sympathizer. Well, think about it. He has this title, king. He's a puppet king, doesn't really have power. You have a Roman governor in the country who does have power. Of course, Agrippa II wants to get rid of Justius Florus as the governor in Israel, because he wants complete rule. So that's why he tries to rat out Justius Florus to the Romans, and that's what he as much as he tries to make peace, the Jews see right through it. Rome's not sure. Rome is not sure what to make of it. And this is most likely when a very famous story in the Talmud happens. The Talmud tells us that the Romans are unclear if the Jews are actually rebelling against them or just rebelling against their governor. So somebody in the Roman Senate, if you will, has the idea of sending a sacrifice to Jerusalem. And the idea being that if the Jews accept the sacrifice in the temple, by the way, that was completely legit. Nations of the world always sent sacrifices to the temple. So if the Jews would accept the sacrifice, then they're not rebelling against Rome. They're rebelling against Justius Florus. And if they don't accept it, then they're rebelling against Rome. Now, the backdrop of this story is the famous Kamsa Bar Kamsa event in Tractate Gittin, where there was a certain man who had a party, and he wanted to invite his friend named Kamsa, and by accident invited his enemy Bar Kamsa. Bar Kamsa comes to the party and doesn't want to be asked to leave because it'll be embarrassing, and he offers to bribe his way in to pay for his plate, pay for the whole party. Well, the friend won't hear anything of it, and he kicks out Bar Kamsa. Bar Kamsa is, again, this shows about the hatred from one Jew to another that went on at the time. Bar Kamsa is so incensed that he basically helps instigate the Romans against the Jews, and he is the one who makes this suggestion of an offering being sent to the temple. Now, what he does is when the offering, the bull was on its way to Jerusalem, was being taken to Jerusalem, he is able to sabotage the animal and give it what's called a mum, give it a tiny little wound that makes it that the Romans don't notice, but makes it questionable if it can be accepted as an offering in the temple. Okay, so we talk about the baseless hatred and how this baseless hatred, one Jew to another, destroyed Jerusalem. This is one specific story which shows quite possibly how it happened, but shows also a culture that was going on at the time. Parenthetically, it's interesting. We mentioned that story as the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Kamsa is not in the story, right? The story is about this man having a party who is nameless, and Bar Kamsa, and their feud. Kamsa, why is he blamed for this? He didn't get the invitation to the party. He wasn't there. So one answer I heard at one point was that it was because, if, he knew about this feud between his friend and Bar Kamsa, and he could have helped to settle it. He didn't do anything. He stood by while this fight went on. I don't know, but it's interesting that we call it the fight, and the Talmud says that the temple is destroyed because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Why does Kamsa get blamed? He's not over here at all. Anyhow, okay, fine. So this offering is sent. It's blemished in a way the Romans don't notice. The rabbis start discussing. Talmud says also is because of the extreme piousness of one of the rabbis that the temple is destroyed, because one of the rabbis said, we can't really bring the offering because people think you can bring such an offering. Others said it was because of political expedience, they should bring the offering. In the end, because of the debate that goes on, the offering isn't brought. Rome notices and thinks that the Jews are incited against Rome. The rebellion is against all of Rome and not just against the governor. Okay, that's how the Talmud explains it, and it basically is clear that there is an out-and-out rebellion of the Jews against the Romans. Now, initially, the Jews are successful in that rebellion, and they kick Agrippa II. Now, initially, Agrippa II is held up in his palace. He escapes. He's kicked out of Jerusalem. The Jews burn his palace down to the ground. Any Roman officer, warrior, whatever it is, soldier, is kicked out of Jerusalem. The city is completely in Jewish control with no Roman influence. And in the year 65, Jerusalem's a free city. They declare their freedom. They declare freedom from the Roman Empire. They declare that they have seceded from the Union, so to speak. And that's the situation in Judah in the year 65. Now, Rome doesn't just stand by and let this go on. Nero, who is still the emperor at this point, sends one of his best officers by the name of Vespasian to put down the rebellion. Now, the Talmud tells us an interesting story. Let's go back to Nero for a minute. I mentioned how Jewish history tells a slightly different story than Roman history as to what happened to Nero. The Talmud tells us that Nero comes to Jerusalem at the time of the rebellion, and he shoots arrows in all four directions, and the wind, if you will, a hand from heaven, however you want to talk about it, makes every single arrow land facing Jerusalem. So Nero takes this as a sign that he is in fact destined to destroy the city of Jerusalem. Now, he sees some children passing by, and he wants to know what they're learning in Cheder. What are they learning in their school? And the children respond quoting a verse from the book of Yechezkel, from Ezekiel, saying, I will lay my vengeance upon Edom, which is the Hebrew word for Rome, by the hand of my people Israel. So, right in the book of Yechezkel, book of Ezekiel, prophesies that one day vengeance will be paid against Rome for destroying the temple. Nero looks at the situation, becomes terrified, and he says that 1 second, the Almighty wants to lay waste to his house, and he wants to blame it on me. Forget it. I am out. And the Talmud goes on to say that he ran away, hiding out from the Romans, and in the meantime, he converted to Judaism because he was so inspired by this situation. So it's interesting that the Roman story is he commits suicide, the Jewish story, because you can imagine how embarrassing it'd be to the Romans that Nero converts to Judaism, but the Jewish story is that he actually converts to Judaism because he's so inspired by this story, by seeing, so to speak, the divine hand and everything that's happening, and he backs out completely. And now, with the emperor, it seems like if we add all these stories and try to make sense out of them, the emperor, there's a rebellion against Nero in Rome. They sentence him to death. And if we go with the Jewish path, he runs away and converts to Judaism. If we go with the Roman path, he commits suicide. Be it as it may, there's no more Nero in Rome. So what happens to Rome? This is what's known as the year of the four emperors, because in 1 year there's going to be complete chaos and civil war until eventually Vespasian will be the man on top at the end of the war. Okay. So at this point, the whole Jewish community, the population of Judea has rebelled against the Romans. We have Vespasian coming to fight the war. He will eventually get to Jerusalem in the year 66. But before he gets to Jerusalem, the Romans had to put down a number of rebellions throughout the country, especially in the Galilee, in the northern part of the country. And they'll use their normal tactic of being just slow and methodical, town by town, city by city, fortress by fortress, using their battle rams and their wonderful Roman technology. And eventually when they'll get to Jerusalem and lay siege on Jerusalem in the year 67. So one of the famous stories that happens during this time period, first of all, when you visit Israel, and especially the Galilee, the north, there are a number of famous fortresses from famous battles that took place between the Jews and the Romans during this time. One famous place is Gamla, which is so-called, Gamla is the Aramaic word for camel. It's so-called Gamla because it, from a distance, looks like a camel's hump. It is often referred to as Masada of the North because there was a great siege and a great holdout there. And there's another such place that is a little due west of Gamla, I believe, or maybe due southwest. I think Gamla is more in the Golan Heights, but a place called Yodfas. And Yodfas also was a mountain, was a mountainous area. The Galilee is pretty mountainous, or at least hilly, and there was a fortress on top of a mountain, and there was a very long siege of the city of Yodfas. And the siege lasts 47 days, which was the third longest siege in the whole war. The second longest siege was Jerusalem, and the first longest siege was Masada, the famous Masada. So it's the third longest siege of 47 days, compared to the other two, which are years, which are much longer. So the Roman officer that is in charge of the siege of Yadvas is somebody by the name of Titus in Hebrew, or Titus, who was the son and will be the successor of Vespasian. And the head of the Jewish army in the Galilee was somebody by the name of Yosef ben Matisyahu HaKohen, or in Latin was known as Flavius Josephus. Now, Flavius Josephus was the head of the Jewish army in the Galilee. Initially was somewhat aligned with Agrippa II, which made the rabbis nervous. In fact, the head rabbi at the time, the Nasi at the time, was Shimon ben Gamliel, and Shimon ben Gamliel wanted him to be deposed because he felt his alliance with Agrippa II was dangerous. But Josephus initially is part of the rebellion against the Romans, and it ends up being a total bloodbath in Yadfas. And in the final day of the siege, there are 40 of the aristocracy, the leadership, the head of the army, whatever it is, that are in a cave anticipating complete Roman destruction the next day. And similar to what happens at Masada a few years later, they draw lots to basically kill themselves. Now, they don't want to just commit suicide. They want to go through this process of each one killing another, and they draw lots to see who will kill who. And in the process, the last person with the last lot is probably manipulated to be this by himself, was none other than Yosef ben Matisyahu HaKohen, Josephus, Flavius Josephus. And in the end, after all the nobles have killed themselves, after all his colleagues have killed themselves, what does he do? He goes with his hands up, turns himself over to the Romans, says, if you kill me, I'm of no value to you, but I know a lot about the military strategy of the Jews. I can be your translator. I speak fluent Latin. And not only that, I'm a pretty good writer. I've written a few histories up until this point. I'll be happy to chronicle your war. Well, through the relationship he already had with Agrippa II, he actually, according to many, knew Titus already and is able to ingratiate himself with Titus, with the Romans. And from this point on in the war, becomes the chronicler of the Roman campaign against the Jews, and those writings eventually become his great work known as the War of the Jews, or the Roman Wars, or the Jewish Wars, depending on what you call it, and it's a great history. So his two major works are the Antiquities of the Jews, which is all the history up until this point. He writes basically from creation up until this point, and it heavily follows the approach we've been teaching and the approach of Tanakh. There is some veering when we get to the Persians, which we understand to be because that's when the Roman hand starts in his writing. And then definitely at the time of his writing of what happened with the Romans, there's a very strong pro-Roman slant because they are his patrons, and that's who he's allied with. And look at everything he wrote. So he has a number of works. His two main works are the Antiquities of the Jews and the War of the Jews, the Wars of the Jews. And so therefore we have, from this point on, a total detailed account of the entire war. Josephus tells this whole story about how he gave himself up. Will tell the whole story of the siege of Jerusalem. Will tell the story of the siege of Masada. He's there the whole time, writing from basically first-hand experience or first-hand knowledge, or at least second-hand knowledge that he's getting from people who were on the other side of the lines, or whatever it might be. Now, this begins one of the great debates in Jewish history. Josephus Flavius, again, in Rome, in Latin, I never know which one's first. You see it different ways both times. But we know Josephus is like Yosef ben Matisyahu, so, okay. Good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? Many call him the ultimate Benedict Arnold of the Jews because he was a traitor. Many say, look, in many ways he agreed with the Perushim, with the rabbis, that this was a fruitless war to fight. And in the end, he realizes that, and so he switches sides. I think the predominant opinion would be, wasn't such a good idea for being a traitor like he was to seemingly just save his own life, but in many ways he gave us one of the greatest gifts that we have from this time period, and that is the wonderful history he wrote, because they are extensive books and they're considered completely authoritative, quoted by many great rabbis. Many Rishonim and Achronim will quote him, and you have the medieval commentaries, later commentaries will quote him, and he's worthy of being quoted. So, hard character to understand, very conflicted character in many, many ways. Okay, eventually the Romans conquer the whole country and come to lay siege to Jerusalem. Vespasian is the head of the army. His son Titus is the number 2. and the Jews are bottled up in the city of Jerusalem. Now, the Talmud tells us that Jerusalem was a wealthy city, and the storehouses in Jerusalem were so stocked that the Jews could have lasted a 20-year siege. Now that's a long siege, right? And you would think that most armies would give up after 20 years. But what happens is you have these zealot groups within Jerusalem, because what basically happens now with all these different groups bottled up in Jerusalem is a civil war breaks out of these groups, a violent war. Each one will declare his section of the city an independent state. So before we had the city declared as independent, now we'll have each little subsection of the city by the different groups declared as an independent state. Total chaos, total civil war. The zealots wanting to inspire the Jews to fight against the Romans will burn down these storehouses, basically forcing the siege into famine. Now, is it 20 years? Was it a long period of time? Not sure, but one thing we can see is that at this point, the problem's not really the Romans on the outside, it's the Jews on the inside. And they forced terrible famine to happen and forced the Jews to fight and basically forced their hand. The Jews have to unite against Rome to basically try and fight for their lives. Now, when it's looking like everything is almost close to being lost, there is a rabbi who is the head of the Av Bezdin, the head of the Sanhedrin at this time, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who has himself smuggled out of Jerusalem. Now, why does he have to be smuggled out of Jerusalem? Because at this point, there was not only a siege from without, but there was a siege from within. In other words, the Romans not only laid siege outside the city, not letting anything or anybody in, but the zealots laid siege from inside the city, not letting anybody out. So there was only one way that you could leave Jerusalem at this time, and that was in a coffin. Now, why was that? Because there is a custom until this very day that we don't bury bodies inside the city of Jerusalem. We don't bury the dead in Jerusalem. We bury them outside of the city. So if you're ever wondering why the Mountain of Olives, right there outside of the city of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, there's a huge graveyard there, that's because that's where they buried people. They went outside of the city to bury people. So the zealots only let coffins out, did not let live people out. And not only that, but before a coffin could leave the city, now, by the way, there weren't coffins. I should be more specific. There were, whatever they would wrap the body in. In classical Jewish law, we don't use coffins. Yes, in the exile, outside the land of Israel, we have to use coffins in many places because it's the law. But technically, according to Jewish law, we're not supposed to use coffins. That's why when we have to use a coffin, we use as flimsy, cheap, biodegradable of a coffin as we can use. We don't want these steel caskets that will never biodegrade. We want plain pine boxes that'll break down unfinished, because that'll be the closest to break down in the ground and get to where we need to be. So whatever they were transferring the bodies in, be it a box, be it a wagon, be it just wrapped it up, unclear. But the zealots would actually stab the bodies before they would leave the city to make sure that they weren't people just trying to escape from the city. Now, according to Jewish law, this is a terrible atrocity. It's called zilzul hames. It's called disgracing dead bodies. But again, that doesn't stop our zealots at this time. Yochanan ben Zakkai, in whichever way that he was wrapped up to get out of the city, was smuggled out of the city as a dead body and miraculously survived the zealots' attempt to stab the box or whatever it was that he was in. And Yochanan ben Zakkai is able to get out of the city. Now, when he gets out of the city, he is able to somehow get all the way to Vespasian, the leader of the campaign. And he greets him saying, "May peace be upon you, Emperor of Rome." Now, again, what was going on at Rome at this time? It was the war. It was the year of the four emperors. There was civil war. There was complete breakdown. There's, there were different people who got to be emperor for a few days, but it was unclear who the emperor really was. But Vespasian's response to Yochanan ben Zakkai is to say, "You're guilty of treason for two reasons. Number one, I'm not the emperor of Rome. There's still another emperor sitting on the throne. So by you calling me the emperor, you're basically saying something treasonous to the emperor that's sitting in Rome. And number two, if you think that with all this civil war going on in Rome, the year of the four kings, that I should be the emperor, what took you so long to get here? So you're guilty of treason for two reasons, says Vespasian to Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai. Just then, a messenger arrives with a message from Rome saying that the civil war has been subdued. The Senate has decided that, in fact, Vespasian should come back from the campaign to take the throne as the emperor of Rome. Now, in Roman culture, there's an idea that the bearer of bad tidings gets bad and the bearer of good tidings gets good. So before Vespasian leaves to go back to claim his throne in Rome, he grants Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai 3 wishes. I think that's where the concept of the genie and the 3 wishes has come from, but he grants him 3 wishes. He says, you brought me these good tidings. Somehow you knew it before the messenger got to me. Therefore I heard it from you, not the messenger. What can I do for you? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asked for 3 things. Number 1, he says, Tenli Yavna v'chachmea. Give me the city of Yavna and its scholars. Now, Yavna, not to be confused with the Hebrew Academy of Cleveland Girls High School, which is also called Yavna. Yavna is a city on the western part of Israel, just due north of Tel Aviv. And as this process that we had described before of the separation of synagogue and state taking place, starting with Hillel and Shammai, still going further and further until this time, we said the Sanhedrin had already left the Temple Mount, by this point it left Jerusalem, and it had taken up residence in the city of Yavna. So Yavna was the city where scholars had started to coalesce. Now at this point in time, many scholars are in hiding, they're afraid to come out. Again, they think you should be fighting the Romans, but they're afraid of the Romans, so they're in hiding. So the first thing that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asked for is, in this war, please leave Yavna alone. Let the scholars coalesce there, don't threaten them, and let Yavna be a center of Jewish scholarship. Okay, first thing he asked for. Second thing he asked for, that the family of Reb Shimon ben Gamliel should be unmolested in the war. Okay. Who was Reb Shimon ben Gamliel? He was the Nasi. He is at this point I think it's the great-grandson of Hillel, or the grandson of Hillel. I lose track with all the Shimon Gamliels and Hillels and who's who. I think I think he was the great-grandson, whatever. Descendant of Hillel. He was the Nasi. The Nasi was the position of the heir apparent to the throne. It's the line of David. Okay? Leave the family of Shimon ben Gamliel alone. Fine? And the final request was a doctor for Reb Tzadok. Now, Reb Tzadok was a rabbi, a very pious rabbi, who, seeing the writing on the wall, had been fasting for 40 years. I don't think that means 40 years straight. I think just daytime for 40 years. But be it as it may, he was very sick at this point and needed to be nursed back to health. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asked for a doctor for Reb Tzadok. Vespasian agreed to all 3 wishes, thinking that he got the better of the old rabbi. Here, he would have given the rabbi anything, and he asked for these 3 stupid little things. Give them to him. Gein gesundheit hate. I'm going back to Rome. I'm leaving my son in charge. Now, the question is often asked, why did Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai not ask for the temple to be left alone? So there's a dispute, and amongst historians, commentaries, one opinion is that he did in fact ask for the temple to be left alone, and Vespasian said, that much I can't do. According to other opinions, he knew not to ask for it because he knew this was the divine decree at this point for the temple to be destroyed, and he knew he wouldn't get it. Okay, but let's take a moment to look at what he did ask for. He asked for Yavna and its scholars, the Sanhedrin, to be left alone. He asked for the family of Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, the house of David essentially, to be left alone. And he asked for a doctor for Reb Tzadok. Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, in this request, shows us the 3 ingredients that are needed for Jewish survival. Torah, the study of Torah, the preservation of Torah law, represented by Yavna and the scholars there. The house of David to be preserved, so one day Mashiach, the Messiah, can in fact come from it. And our sages, and those who came before us, and our elderly, those who we can learn from. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying, if we have these 3 things, we'll survive this exile. And it doesn't matter what you do to us. So Vespasian gave him the three things, thinking he was giving him nothing. But as we'll see in the coming weeks, in giving him those three things, he gave us everything. He solidified the process that Hillel and Shammai had put into place of trying to separate Jewish nationalism from Torah, making us a religion that would survive without the country. That is what is solidified with these three things. And we're going to see that this process continues to take form of the essential Jewish people that we are still today, almost 2,000 years later. So Vespasian thought he gave nothing, but in these three requests, he gave the survival of the Jewish people over to Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, and because of that, we live on today. That's the year 68. Finally, in the year 69, the siege is successful. There's complete famine in the city. The Romans break through the wall on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz. Now, again, provoked by the Zealots, that really the starving Zealots, but the Zealots, the Jews fight viciously. It's door-to-door combat, hand-to-hand combat. Many Romans die. According to Deus Cassius, Titus himself dies, because now, as I said, Vespasian's the emperor in Rome. His son Titus is in charge of the campaign, and it's a bloody battle, even though if you think about it today, I'm not sure at which point, or if we know the point, I don't know if Josephus says it, maybe it does, I just don't remember, but at what point the Romans penetrated. But imagine if you've ever walked from, let's say Shar Shechem, the Damascus gate, to the Kotel. How long does it take already? 10 minutes, tops? It takes the Romans 3 weeks to get to the temple. And it's a bloody battle. And so they originally break through the walls on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz. That's why the 17th of Tammuz is a fast day for us, the Shavas of Tammuz, starting the 3 weeks of mourning that lead up to the 9th day of Av, Tisha B'Av, when Titus eventually gets to the temple, lays siege to the temple, burns the temple to the ground, and that is on this fateful day of Tisha B'Av, that was declared so many years before as a day of crying for the Jewish people. We've already seen a multitude of tragedies that have happened on this day. That's the day when the spies came back with their negative report at the time of Moses. That was the day that the generation in the desert would die every year in the desert. That's the day that the first temple was destroyed. That's the day now that the second temple is destroyed. At the time of its destruction, it is a bloodbath. Josephus says 1 million Jews are killed at that point. Another 100,000 are taken as slaves into Rome, completely crashing the Roman slave market. Jews were used as Roman entertainment, either as gladiators or to fight animals, as was the Roman sport and entertainment at the time. And it is a terrible time to be a Jew nonetheless. But if you have these zealot groups, they're not going to give up so easily. So you see that even though the temple is destroyed in the year 69, the rebellions, or small pockets of rebellions, are going to last for another 3 to 4 years or so. And the last of which is the rebellion of Matada, the siege of Matada. So to conclude for tonight, the story of Matada. Some of the zealots from Jerusalem flee the city and take up station in Masada. Now, Masada was an impregnable mountaintop fortress. It was first used by the Maccabees as a fortress in their war with the Greeks. It was later a beautiful vacation resort was made by Herod, and now the Zealots are taking up residence there to, I don't know what. It's a good question. What were they trying to do? Jerusalem was gone. Temple was destroyed. 1 million Jews have been killed. 100,000 are slaves. What are they fighting for already at this point? Well, I think it is a classical situation of cognitive dissonance that here they thought, they convinced themselves somehow if they keep fighting, they'll be able to push the Romans back and take over Jewish control of the country. I don't know what made them think that, but it was a death sentence to begin with, because yes, the mountain is impregnable. If you've ever been to Masada, you know that there are only two ways up. The first way up is what's called the snake path, which there is no way you're getting an army up the snake path, because even as much as the Romans sent some scouts to try to get up the mountain, all the Jews had to do on the top of the mountain is take their bow and arrows, shoot them down, no big deal. On the other side, when the Romans realized that they couldn't go up the snake path, they built a ramp. And the idea was that they would be able to get their battle towers and their ramming, their battle rams and all that up the ramp. And then they could lay siege to the city, or they could bring their siege up to the level of the city and eventually get in and conquer the city. Now, initially, as they start building the city, what do the residents on top of Masada do? Again, take their bows and arrows and their boulders and start throwing them at the slaves. So the Romans aren't going to be outsmarted by a bunch of Jews. What do? They start using Jewish slaves to build the ramp. And initially, those on top of Masada kill the Jewish slaves. And then at least take a slight step back and say, whoa, 1 second. What are we doing here? We're not going to kill Jewish slaves. We're not going to do that. We're not going to kill other Jews because the Romans put them into slavery. And at that point, the people on top of Masada realize they're done because this hill, this mountain, this ramp, if you will, is going to be completed. They're going to bring all their battle machines up, and they're going to be done for. Now, initially, the Jews are still on top of Masada are fighting it, and they do their best. But then they realize that once the Romans get their battle tower to the top of the ramp, they say, all is done. And they decide to do the exact same thing that was done before in the north, that we talked about before in the north, at the time of Josephus being in the north, that they draw their lots and they decide who's going to die. And then when the Romans get up there, they find all of the weapons of the Jews piled in the middle of the mountain, and they find all the Jews dead. So the war is essentially over with that. Now, according to Josephus, there was a mother and daughter who hid away from everyone, and they come out and tell the whole story of what happened, telling about the last speech of the leader of Masada, and that's how Josephus claims that he got it from this girl and this mother. Again, is that true? Did he make up this last speech, and there's no mother and daughter that ever came up to him? No way of knowing by us. But that's the end of Masada. Now, question that we'll end with tonight. Is what happened on top of Masada a Jewish thing or not? Is it in line with Judaism? Is it in line with what we know about our religion? The simple answer is absolutely not. It was the whole rebellion was bad according to the rabbis. And of course, once the rebellion is over, just prolonging it, 1,000 people prolonging it for what? And it ends up that those 1,000 people just end up committing suicide. There is nothing heroic, there is nothing brave, there is nothing good about what happened on top of Masada. And unfortunately, from really not this point, but roughly this point on in Jewish history, Masada becomes a symbol of Jewish resistance. The early settlers of the modern state of Israel in the late 1800s, early 1900s will look at Masada as a holy spot. And they'll take pilgrimages to Masada and climb Masada because that represents the Jewish bravadoism that exists in this story. And not only that, but a slogan is coined at this time in Hebrew, Masada od lo tipol, that Masada will not fall again. And it even goes as far as to today. When a soldier is sworn into the Israeli army, I believe that he or she has several choices as to where the swearing in as a soldier will take place. Some do it at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, and some do it at Masada, saying these words, Masada od lo tipol. Matada will not fall again. There is nothing Jewish about this idea. It's Jewish bravadoism. It's almost rewriting history. What happened in Matada was the whole rebellion was terrible. We see that 1 million Jews ended up dead, 100,000 sold into slavery. And for sure what happened in Masada, there's nothing heroic or Jewish about it. So I hope from this point forward, whenever you hear Masada memorialized in a great way, or you hear the phrase Masada od lo tipol, Masada won't fall again, you will remember that those are not Jewish ideas. Now it's interesting. Last time I was at Masada, I don't know if they still show this video, but the video they show before you go up the mountain actually does a pretty fair representation of what the mountain was. Was it good? Was it bad? And whoever the actor is says, I'll leave it to you to figure out. So I'm glad at least the Ministry of Antiquities made it that they have to paint the right picture at the national site, at the archaeological site, but at least in the modern Jewish psyche, what it's remembered as is something very far from the truth, and that is that there is nothing Jewish about Masada. I thank you all for joining us tonight. Next week, we will continue with the aftermath of the destruction of the temple. By the way, this will only be the first of at least 3 major wars between the Romans and the Jews, but that's what we will talk about in the weeks to come. I thank you so much for coming, and I thank you for listening.